Hi.
That's good.
Bobby Lambert, DRR outsider and skeptic in general, but involved willy-nilly very much in working with UN donors and NGOs on DRR. I think it's wonderful what we've seen here. I really like the format. I think the way of presenting the data is great. I'm glad to hear it's this beta process. I think it's very good to get that consultation out. I think what's really important is this mainstreaming issue. And what I've seen is the importance of what you call risk-informed programming, people-focused risk-informed programming, looking at the hazards that people in their daily lives, the vulnerable people who are highlighted in this report, what they face. And I think if we start from that perspective of the vulnerable, the really vulnerable groups in the countries or around the world and take a risk-informed programming approach, that will help. I think the danger that I see looking at the DRR insiders is there's a little box and DRR gets pushed into a corner through its own fault, largely. It's put into a box in the corner because it focuses, first of all, on a certain set of hazards, just the natural hazards. Whereas in here, if you go to page 38, I think you've highlighted very elegantly the issue to do with the major hazards that people focus, both an environment conflict and a hazard itself, and how people's vulnerability is just so tied up with conflict, fragility, poverty and inequality. And we know that what is needed to address those issues. And it's not just about early warning systems, it's about root causes. We heard the comment about root causes and how important that is. And I think we have to be very careful on the numbers. I've heard this number 8 to 1. I am very skeptical of that number. And I think we have to be very careful. I think there's a real problem with numbers in this, numbers and how we present them, because we can be targeted or accused of being the merchants of fear on some of this, and I think we have to be very careful. But I think there's a real problem in the numbers. But I think I go back to the people-focused, risk-informed programming against the risks that affect their daily lives. I think that's what we've got to do. Okay.
A couple more comments before we go back to the panel. This gentleman here. Say who you are.
It's Ian Hayner from Atkins. I'm definitely not a DRR person, so thank you very much for this. It's been a very engaging discussion. I think there are 2 points I'd like to raise. One is taking on board your 8 to 1. I've worked with this philosophy for 30 years, and it does work. There's a lot behind it. You estimate what is avoided, and you turn that into some economics, and our friends in KL would understand that. It's a very powerful tool, very important to getting the politicians on our side. So we need to engage with that more. I think the second question, though, is I find the language used a little bit too remote. And I think this is something that is quite difficult for you because I work in flood management. Okay, I understand what a flood is. It's a lot of water coming downhill. It knocks over houses and people get washed away. A disaster is not that. It's something that happens and everybody, you see it on the TV. So I think the language you're using is something that we need to bring forward, in my opinion. And I think the second problem with disaster is actually if you solve the problems of disaster, you don't have one. So actually what you're selling is, it's like turkeys for Christmas. You know, they don't vote for it because actually it's going away. So you've got to, I think, use a different language to maintain the technology. Okay, I don't know. We can talk more about it, but that's my first impressions.
Okay, anything else on those themes? I think there's some, Emily, do you want to pick up on that? I've got one question from an old colleague, by the way, so it's always good if it's somebody I know who sends me a text, so I'll come to that in a minute.
I wanted just to ask a question following up on the root causes of vulnerability issue. I just wondered if the panelists really think that HFA or some follow-up to the HFA is the right vehicle through which to try and reduce those root causes of risk, and whether it, and if it is, you know, what can it really do? Where do you see those efforts being focused? Because I think, you know, you can broaden it out and be about all kinds of vulnerability faced by people, but then how do you focus it back in? What can the HFA to actually do about it, and is it the right vehicle for that?
I might just put Debbie Hillier from Oxfam's comment on the table there, because I think it links in to a certain extent. Debbie writes, we've only got a few months to Sendai, so we need to get specific. What would the panel say as one clear commitment that states and potentially others need to make in the framework. So what should they really be taking into the negotiations? From Oxfam's perspective, a commitment that all countries should have clear, standardised quality loss and damage databases. If countries aren't measuring their losses, it's very difficult for you to believe that they're managing them, and this of course applies to the UK as well, right, Debbie? So, is it directly related? Yeah, last comment, yes, please. Can you just say who you are with the microphone, sorry, please?
Maggie Ibrahim, World Vision. I'd like to build on Debbie's comment in terms of disaster losses, because there's been lots of discussion over the years about this. And I'd like us to kind of broaden that in terms of not only looking at the losses. I do agree that we need to track those, and those are easy political buy-in. But I'd like us to focus a little bit more on what kind of data sets do we need to look at DRR investments. So practically speaking, from World Vision as an example, we've got 80 million a year turnover. And I'm trying to work with our national office to be able to track our DRR investments, and then to link those into what kind of vulnerability assessments do we do, how do we identify those risks and identify costs and investments to those risks as well, and then track out to the outcome. So is the outcome for us as a child well-being organization, is the outcome in terms of Ethiopia around stunting and nutrition, is that what we want to track and make a very good case of? And I'd like to encourage, I love this, the way that the conversation is going, and I really commend ODI and all the folks who've put energy into this, but I'd like to get us to move a little bit forward now that we're taking a little bit of a different stance. So if we could add a module perhaps on the connections as well to the WHS, the World Humanitarian Summit, and perhaps that goes with your connection to other initiatives. And then I'd also like, if I can, take another moment to suggest in the conflict and fragility, actually, if we're talking about reducing risks in conflict settings, let's use Iraq right now as an example with the IS. What would we actually propose? We wouldn't propose finance ministries to get involved at the moment in terms of how to support risk reduction for IDPs. We would suggest that we need to do much better risk-sensitive humanitarian action work. And so that's where some of the language around risk reduction to other stakeholders would come in.
Thank you, Maggie. So that's quite a lot for the panel to respond to, and I'm going to try and go to Bangkok and India as well. Tom, quite a lot was directed at what the report could do there. Do you want to pick on that? But I certainly want to Steve on some of the points.
So two quick, I can't pick up all of those. Let me pick up two issues. First, in terms of disaster risk reduction in the SDGs. I entirely agree. We've had quite a significant problem in a sense that the NDMOs who are championing disaster risk reduction either don't know who their SDGs representative is, haven't talked to them, or don't have the tools to actually support the conversation. We've seen that again and again. So in the Sustainable Development Goals Open Working Group, we're relying on a set of other connections, really, either by international agencies supporting the narrative and evidence around this, or by kind of direct one-to-one advocacy, bilateral relationships. But what has emerged is actually, so far, a very good result. In the zero draft of the Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 goal areas. 6 of those include targets around disaster risk reduction. Now, the process that's starting today in New York is to start to cull those and to get down to a smaller number. On Friday, actually, ODI released a briefing to try and support that process of culling and say, look, don't cull all these 8 DRR targets, but do try and focus on what's important, including around strengthening disaster risk management systems and tracking disaster losses. And so if you go on ODI's website, you can see a brand new publication on that designed to support governments, and had a dialogue actually over the weekend with the UK's lead on this, David Hallam, in that regard. That's one. Second issue, I want to give a plug to a piece of work that we're doing in partnership with the London School of Economics and with the World Bank. Very much on this issue that was raised by a number of people, including Dr. Sirimani, on this 8-to-1 ratio, what works in terms of economic arguments. we are starting from the basis that cost-benefit analysis, this 1 to 8, 1 to 4, 1 to 6, does not work as a narrative and a set of evidence to convince developing country governments to make investments in disaster risk reduction. The very simple reason, as was voiced from the Maldives, is that you are comparing two entirely different pots of money, two entirely different political economies. Investing your $1 in advance has to be set against or in the context of investments in education, in health, and in response, they're damn right, it comes in from elsewhere, it's not your money, and therefore you don't really need to budget it in quite the same way. Two very different sets of conversations and contexts. What we're doing is trying to say, well, actually, is there a new business case that needs to be raised for investments in disaster risk management, not based on potentially avoided losses, but based on disaster risk management as a core dimension of sustainable economic growth, of wealth creation, of poverty reduction, of the social benefits that are brought by stability, and to look at essentially what is a new economics of disaster risk management, which I think is gaining region by region, country by country, quite a lot of traction, including here in the UK, where the Environment Agency is leading a review on what are the social benefits, the economic benefits of investment in disaster risk reduction if you don't immediately start thinking about counting avoided losses. And so I think this is something that's gaining energy. We have a session at the Understanding Risk Conference in 2 weeks' time here in London with LSE, with UNDP, with the World Bank to discuss this issue. Very happy to give you more details of that. And we plan to produce a document by March 2015 on this issue. And we are beginning a conversation with a set of governments over the next 2 or 3 months around this issue in Mexico, Jamaica, Senegal, and Myanmar, to look at where the evidence is that this is happening. So that's our contribution to this mainstreaming discussion, Sam, and that will be a conversation with finance ministries, economic development ministries, and not with NDMOs.
Tom, that's very useful to hear about that. I'm sure there'll be a lot of interest. And Steve, do you want to pick up on any of the issues, both about the economics and numbers, and also this interesting point about language that we use?
Yes, where to start, really? It's, could I make it just a general point about the political will and the politicians, because it's something which I think we have to take into account, and I think it was mentioned by the UN as well, that if we stand in their shoes, many of them have 5 years to leave something behind, and when they go on doorsteps and knock and talk to people, DRR it's not number one on what they're talking about on doorsteps. And so this is hard work, getting them to even acknowledge it. And therefore we have to use whatever tools we have as civil servants in our toolbox. And whether we like it or not, the monetary and the 1 to 8 and the 1 to 4 is a tool in the toolbox. And for somebody who may only be there for 5 years and who will not see the result of their investment politically 20 years down the line, you know, I think we have to sort of take that into consideration and think it through quite carefully about what we're putting in front of them to encourage them to do these things. And clearly it's not my job to stick up for them, but when we're speaking to them, these issues are important. They can go out to their constituents and they can say, this is what we do with the money which we're taking from you for taxes. So I do think this database that Debbie mentioned, this evidence we can place in front of them is terribly, terribly important. And I'm very glad that nobody else asked me if I've got any other examples of it in the UK, because I haven't. The Environment Agency are actually the only people who keep anything like that, you know, and we just don't have that information for me to put in front of you. The other thing which concerns me slightly, and this is that we all work in silos, and at national level it's been terribly difficult to get people together to talk about all of these kind of issues. And that's why if I took up Debbie's challenge to choose one of these 9 which I wanted to take forward, it would actually be the enabling greater local, and I think you brought up the point, enabling greater local government and community level engagement. That's where I think we've got to move it down to. It's no good national governments who, as I said, may not be there very long, telling local people what they need. It's got to be the other way, and they have to realise that there's something in it for them.
Thank you for that and answering that question, Steve. I think that might resonate with some of the comments that Mihir made earlier as well about cities and other aspects. But I'd like to just turn to Shamika. Is there any comments that you want to make in responding to any of the points from the floor?
Thank you. I think, to me, it seems that everybody is kind of converging onto a same sort of place. The whole point of convincing has been discussed. The need for mainstreaming has been discussed. Doing more economics. You know, maybe the numbers may not be 100% right, but unfortunately, I also used to work for a finance ministry. And unfortunately, finance ministries are full of economists, and you basically have to talk their language to make a case. So that's also out there. So we should not undermine the power of numbers. I guess the problem that we have in our own work in ESCAP is that, as somebody mentioned, that the disaster loss data is really bad. It's very difficult to do cross-country comparisons. It's very difficult to do time series analysis because this data is, there are no statistical standards or methodology or in collecting this data. It's very ad hoc data. So once you get this thing and start to see some connections, it's very difficult to see these connections because data is very poor. So we have that added disadvantage, among other things. So I think we need to pay attention to the whole disaster statistics issue. I know it is not fashionable, but we are taking an attempt here in our region because our member states just mandated us. We just had our ministerial meeting, and we were mandated to start working on whole set of disaster statistics because we work very closely with the statistical division. Commission of the headquarters. So that is out there, and I think there's a lot of work needs to be done on this the data front and coming up with numbers. And I'm very happy to hear that the LSE and World Bank and ODI have started working on this issue, and we have done studies in ESCAP, and where we have seen that disasters, like for example, we look at the Pakistan floods and some other disasters, we have seen how the MDG gains have been rolled back, how children have been pulled out of schools and they never went back to school. So you see, and the maternal mortality numbers, we have seen those numbers deteriorating after a series of small disasters or after a big disaster, like the floods in 2010 in Pakistan. So this evidence is out there. So please, we would really like to work with you and help you. And we also need to take this message to our region because ours is the most disaster-prone region, and only a few countries are ready. Of the most disaster-prone countries, like Indonesia, yes, they have taken it on board, the mainstream, and so forth. The Philippines, but there are others who have not done this work. And finally, I also want to mention, yes, it is very important to have local governments on board, and because the response at the end is at that level. But please do not forget the power of national governments, because that's where the budgets are done, and that's where the transfers to provinces are determined. All these equalization payment systems, transfer systems, is all determined at the center, and the center is the one that collects all the income tax and VAT and all that, so that the revenue is generated at the center. So yes, the local government, the role of local government, we should never forget, but do not forget the importance of convincing national governments. Thank you.
Can we just go to you? Because you framed your presentation very much around a conversation with decision makers. You didn't mention numbers quite so much, and that's come up since. Have you got any comments you wish to make at this stage? You go ahead, Mihir.
I think the main interest that one finds increasing around DRR-related discussion, both within the disaster management authorities, but also among the finance ministries and ministries of other economic development, is one, obviously loss and damage, but also what are the economic opportunities for development in DRR. So are there economic opportunities for accelerating economic growth at subnational level, city level, for example, district level, for example, state level, for example? Is there an opportunity for increased level of skills and enhancing job opportunities within DRR? Is there opportunity for more reduction of poverty at local level within DRR through DRR measures? And that's the kind of questions are attracting more attention from DRR these days, both within the country at subnational level as well as within the region. Thank you.
Right, we've got time for one more round of questions. I'm just going to gather up a few if we have any. If not, there's some nice coffee and pastries outside. So our colleague from the Pakistan National Disaster Management Authority.
Thank you. Just to comment on the involvement of other ministries within this DRR mainstreaming is really very difficult. And there are many issues, some of which I can share here. And that is the basic thing is the financing system of UN for the disaster. If you go to fast tracking system of UN, you would see a lot of funding which is coming after the disaster is designated for humanitarian issues. And most of the implementing partners like UNICEF or other, or the local governments or others, are not able to spend that money on DRR because that is restricted. So that gives an incentive to those organizations who are working on humanitarian issues rather than DRR. And also NDMA is working for humanitarian issues more than DRR. DRR is a recently developed concept which NDMA is working because a lot of funding is coming from UN to develop DRR within the NDMA, and NDMOs are being trained for that. We talked to Planning Commission and Finance Commission and other national departments to be part of that. But as Steve said, their priority is next 5 years. So if I am a housing minister, would I go for 200 more houses, or should I do for DRR in the existing house? So that is my consideration. What we did was that we tried to involve the local MPs in the area where we were doing the housing things. So the money which was coming for settling the flood victims, for example, was spent with the consultation of local MPs, and the houses they get were more DRR fitted than just on the humanitarian basis. So that developed a new interest in the politician to be involved in their constituency. And that is something which we think could be done with other MPs to involve them in the local development so that they could see their interest in their future constituency.
Thank you. That really brings it to life. Thank you very much. I've got Lindsay over here and a question here after that. Don't mind which route the mic goes. So can you make it short, Lindsay, because I think we want to aim to wrap up in the next couple of minutes.
Lindsay Jones, ODI. Shamika raised the tension between the agendas and pots of money between the climate change adaptation agenda and the DRR agenda. I think that echoes a lot in many developing countries in having that perhaps siloed approach and different units, different people, different technical people who are addressing both of those agendas. I'd just like to hear the panel's thoughts on how we can try and prevent this siloed nature between the two. And what the HFA2 agenda can do in trying to promote that, bearing in mind that we also have the UNFCCC negotiations happening at the same sort of time. So thoughts on that would be useful.
So question here in the middle. Is there anybody else want to make a final comment apart from this gentleman? Okay.
Thank you. My name is Jesse DiMaria Kinney from Plan International, the Climate Change and DRR Policy Officer. My couple of comments came on a few points that Steve mentioned, and it links very much to what Lindsay had just said. But the first is the political will and particularly communications. And I think that it's critical that politicians and, for example, this document, which lays a nice base for it, do actually communicate that DRR is intrinsically linked to their livelihoods. It's also linked to the safety of children in schools. And this leads right into the second point about silo approaches, and Lindsay had just mentioned it, where when we look at what the root causes are, and when we look at some of the other key issues, which would be the hierarchy of risk that was mentioned and the scale of risk, that just goes to the need to bring DRR into the other development frameworks and into the UNFCCC frameworks. And just to throw out a point, this also goes to the panel, is one of my concerns with the lack, not the lack of linkages to the other frameworks, but just the fact that they are being dealt with separately. And then, of course, with the World Humanitarian Summit, which is now coming out. And again, this is now a new issue. And I just hope that, I guess, the World Humanitarian Summit somehow adopts the previous frameworks that will have been approved by then as a basis for the World Humanitarian Summit. Thank you.
Okay, so you've echoed a point that you guys in the NGO sector think alike. Debbie Hillier made the same point as how is HFA2 going to link to the World Humanitarian sector. So, I mean, just finally to the panelists, you know, the clock is ticking here. It's not waiting for nice research from ODI and CDKN and LSE. There is a schedule of meetings. A Sendai meeting is next March, and the inexorable sort of clock of international meetings is getting closer. This report is a fantastic contribution to that, and I think this meeting has endorsed that. But we're still living in a world of silos, as we've heard this morning, and some real uncertainty about the data. So what are we going to do? How are we going to break out of these silos and make a difference? Steve? Come on, answer it all.
How are we going to break out of these silos? Yeah, well, I've been trying that for 8 years, and I'm not sure that I know the answer to that. I don't personally think we ever are, but I think what we've got to start to do is to put information to ministers and to the political leadership, which makes it a no-brainer. And at the moment, just if I take your example, if I go to a minister and say, schools in the UK, protect them, they'll say, from what? What disaster? What's going to happen to them? Hospitals? What? And therefore it's, you know, I have nothing to give them. But I think there is stuff I can give them, but it's getting people to put the databases together to say, this is dangerous. This is a problem. If you don't do something about this, something will happen. It's about putting the economic arguments, you know. If we spend this much now, we will save this much down the road. But they will never see it. You know, I don't suppose there's anybody in this room who can name the environment minister who was around in 1960 who started spending money on UK flood defences. Because he's a memory and his legacy is kind of starting now. And that's the difficulty. And I don't have the answer to that, but because it's a slow drip. But I think if we're starting the drip.
Yeah. That's helpful. Tom?
I think what Steve talked about as a priority for the UK about the local level community leadership, I do feel is important around the world. I think we had an experience in CDKN where we brought together a group of countries from around the Asia-Pacific region to Bangkok a few months ago. And one of the biggest discussions was this issue of the relationship between national government and local government, particularly this area around financing. And the fact that you can have a beautiful DRR plan at the local level, you can have every community member engaged. If you don't have any money, it's quite difficult. In the UK, we have exactly the same problem. There is a break between kind of national government support and local government. We have resilience officers that don't get funded if there's problem with local government allocations and things like that. So I think the connections between national and local are really important. Breaking the silos internationally, I I would point to it. There's a number of areas that need to be dealt with. Financing is an important one at the national, international level. Getting the Green Climate Fund architecture right, for example, that's actually inclusive across different government departments is important. I think there's also a very big role for UN resident coordinators' offices, actually, where the UN system is fragmented, of course, in terms of its sectoral issues, in terms of its mandates. But actually, if the UN system was coordinated at country level, in a way where DRR was pushed across different sectors in a coordinated fashion, then I think we would see a bigger step forward in a number of countries. Maybe in Nepal there's been progress on this, but almost nobody can ever name another country where there's good DRR level coordination across the UN system. Part of the UN action plan now is to do this and to do this right, and it's going to be important for governments to recognise that they need to hold UN account for that plan. Thank you, sir.
Good, Tom. Mihir, any brief, short final comment from you?
I think the role of media, which is not shouldn't be undermined, and to break the silos from one sector to another. In the recent times, we've seen last year the tremendous energy that the role of media has been able to unleash to make the governments, local, national work together, make one department work with another. So I think direct and ongoing engagement with media on breaking the silo approach is one. And second, to show the performance of whatever money that is spent on the ground. When that is shown, more money follows, not always, but very often. Yeah. So how the DRR projects are performing on the ground, more often it's shown in terms of money and benefits, more likely it is to attract resources from the national budgets. Thanks.
Thanks, Mihir. Shamika and Puji, any final comments from you folks in Thailand?
Sam, from me, I would like to address one question that was left out. Is HFA an appropriate vehicle to address the root causes of vulnerability? My answer to that is no. I think HFA has been very successful in galvanizing attention to maintain and sustain our conversation around disaster risk reduction. HFA has been successful because it is voluntary. A lot of subscription around it is voluntary, but that's also the weakest link of HFA, which we talk about lack of accountability. Now, from here onward, I think we need to make our decision makers aware of this, the limit of HFA can do. And that leads us to the second argument. Because HFA is limited, it is imperative that HFA should be linked formally with other mechanisms. At the regional level, there is regional commission. And these two processes are simply not connected. Regional platform of HFA in one hand, and regional commission as formal process of decision making at the regional level is disconnected. And the example will go on. So in brief, I think we do need to argue for the limit of HFA and thus call for formal connection with other mechanisms. Thank you, sir.
I think I agree with all of you, and Apuji said it all. I think we need to broaden the horizons for the HFA for it to take root and it to be part of the development strategies and development frameworks of our countries. Thank you.
Well, I think that's the time to stop. I think there's coffee and cakes outside for those who want to have a conversation on this. This was a conversation this morning, and a very good one, I thought, built on an excellent document. From CDKN and ODI's point of view, this is an ongoing process, more documentation, more research findings, more meetings in different parts of the world. So this is ongoing, and I hope we can continue that journey with those of you in the room and online. So thank you very much to Mihir, to Shamika and Puji for joining us, and thank you to the technology that's connected you in extremely well, Rob in particular for managing that. And thank you, Steve, for joining us, and Tom, thank you very much. Very good session. Thank you very much.